The purpose of this lecture is to supplement the content you've read about plant cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems. We'll start by reviewing the plant cell briefly, and then we'll focus more on the tissues, mentioning the difference between the meristematic and the adult tissues. And then within the adult tissues, we'll examine the 3 different tissue types: dermal tissue, ground tissue, and vascular tissue. And then we'll examine the structure and function of each of the plant organs, specifically the leaf, the stem, and the root. We'll examine the reproductive organs, such as flowers, later in the semester. And then finally, we'll examine the 2 plant organ systems, the shoot system and then the root system. And we'll look at the organs that are included within each of those systems, and then also their overall functions. We'll start by briefly reviewing the plant cell. This topic was covered pretty thoroughly in your reading, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it. But I want to emphasize the importance of knowing that plant cells are eukaryotic cells, and you should know how those cells differ from prokaryotic cells. So the cell in the diagram here is a plant cell, and as you can see, it has a nucleus, which is shown in orange and yellow, and then it has many membrane-bound sacs or organelles. So those are structures that you won't find in prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are very simple cells, whereas eukaryotic cells have their DNA enclosed in a nucleus and then many membrane-bound organelles. You should be familiar with the basic structure of the eukaryotic cell and the function of some of those membrane-bound organelles, including, in the case of the plants, the central vacuole, the nucleus and the DNA, the cell wall, the chloroplast, and the mitochondria. So I'm highlighting these structures because these are structures that we're going to continue to talk about as we move forward with the semester. So the central vacuole is seen in the diagram in blue. This is the most dominant structure in the plant cell. It's huge. In some cases, it takes up 90% of the volume of the plant cell. This is a place where plants store certain metabolic compounds, a place where they store waste or toxic compounds. It's also important in maintaining the turgor pressure of the cell, so it's kind of like a water balloon that can exert a positive pressure on the plasma membrane and the cell wall, making the cell turgid or full of water. The nucleus is shown in orange and yellow here, and this is the structure that houses and protects the DNA, which is the cell's genetic material. The DNA is the information that is responsible for the structure and the function of the cells. So there's information in there for building proteins, and those proteins are doing thousands of different things for the cell. They're playing a really important role in determining what the cell does and also what it looks like. The cell wall is the green outer covering of the cell in the diagram. It's a really tough, rigid structure that gives the plant cell protection, and it also helps it to keep its rigid shape. The chloroplasts are seen here in green, the green discs in the plant cell. The chloroplasts are structures that are conducting the process of photosynthesis, which we'll talk more about. But the basic overview of photosynthesis is that this is the process that plants are using to make their carbohydrates, which are their energy storing molecules. So this is how they're feeding themselves through the process of photosynthesis, which takes place in the chloroplast. That food is important, but what the cell really needs to function is a molecule called ATP. And it's the mitochondria that can take those carbohydrates and convert them to that energy source, ATP. So you should be familiar with the basic structure and function of the plant cell. Moving on to tissues, which are similar cell types working together for a common function. So an example of a tissue in your body would be your fat. So those are a bunch of fat cells that work together to help insulate your body and cushion your organs. In plants, there are two different categories of tissues. There's meristematic tissue and non-meristematic or adult tissues. The meristematic tissues are made of dividing cells. So these are cells that are dividing to produce daughter offspring. So one cell divides to produce two cells, and then those two cells can divide to produce two more cells. And these meristematic regions of the plant are limited to a couple of locations. And this diagram to the right is showing us the locations of meristematic tissues. The meristematic tissue is located at the tips of the plant shoots and at the tips of the plant roots. So this is really important areas. These are really important areas of growth. As these cells divide, the plant is able to grow taller and is able to grow its roots further down into the soil. The other kind of meristematic tissue is called lateral meristems, and these are associated with stems and secondary growth. So this diagram on the right is a cross section of a stem, and it's pointing out the location of the meristematic tissue. So these dotted lines are showing us the locations of these meristematic tissues. So there's a ring of meristematic tissue all around the outside of a stem, not quite on the outside, but all around the outer region of a stem. And when these cells divide, they divide to make the stem grow in girth. So this is how a sequoia tree can grow to have a circumference of 20 feet. It's because of the division of cells in the lateral meristems. The other category of tissues in plants are the non-meristematic tissues or non-dividing tissues or adult tissues. And we botanists recognize three different kinds of adult tissues: vascular, ground, and dermal tissues. And this diagram shows us the location of the three adult tissues throughout the plant body. So it's showing us here a cross section of a leaf, and we can see in purple the vascular tissue, the dermal tissue is in green, and then the ground tissue is this yellow or beige color. So it's showing us the locations of the adult tissues in the leaf, in a cross section of the stem, and then also in a cross section of the root. So as you can see, the dermal tissue is covering the outside of the plant body. The vascular tissue is in a central core within the root, but then it's sort of in these bundles in a ring in the stem. And then in the leaf, it's in these little bundles throughout. The ground tissue is sort of the tissue that surrounds the vascular tissue. So it's outside of that vascular cylinder in the root. It's in the middle of the stem between these little vascular bundles, but also to the outside of the vascular bundles. And then it's all around these little vascular bundles within the leaf. Let's take a closer look at the vascular tissue. Vascular tissue includes xylem and phloem, which are both complex tissues because they include more than one cell type. So, for example, xylem, which we see here in the inner part of these vascular bundles in the cell, and then these orange cells in this diagram, includes long, tough, straw-like cells called tracheids or vessel elements, and also some associated parenchyma cells. So it includes multiple cell types. Their function is to transport water from the roots of the plant, where it's absorbed from the soil, up to the leaves, where it's required for photosynthesis and other metabolic processes. So that's why we see the direction of the arrows pointing up in this diagram in the xylem tissues. Phloem is the other kind of vascular tissue. It's also a complex tissue. We can see here phloem in these vascular bundles in the stem is located to the outside of the xylem, and it's made up of cells called sieve elements or sieve members, which are these large cells, and then they also have these little companion cells, these more narrow cells that are associated with each sieve member, and they're involved in loading up the sieve elements with nutrients and organic molecules that are moved around the plant through the phloem. So I want to point out, so this arrow shows the dominant direction of flow in the phloem as being down, but that's really not true. So phloem moves from a source to a sink. So at some times of the year, the source of organic molecules like carbohydrates is the leaves. So they're making carbohydrates through photosynthesis, and then through the phloem, they can move down to the roots, but maybe they can move over to a flower or up to a flower that's growing. So they move from source to sink rather than always being moved down through the phloem. These are a couple of micrographs of a plant stem where you can clearly see those bundles, the vascular bundles. Here the vessel elements are stained red, and I wanted to point out that the vascular tissues not only provide transportation of water and other molecules around the plant body, but they're also really tough cells that provide the plant with rigid support and strength. So the wood of plants is made up of xylem cells. It's really tough material. Now let's take a look at the ground tissue. So recall on this diagram that the ground tissue is this tissue that surrounds the vascular tissue inside the root and the stem and the leaf. It is a simple tissue because unlike the vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, it's made up of one cell type. So yet there are a variety of functions for ground tissue. In the leaf, many of these ground tissue cells that surround the vascular tissues are conducting photosynthesis. The ground tissue also performs storage functions for the plant. So think about a potato, which is actually an underground stem. Those are that's ground tissue that's loaded with starch, an energy source for the plant. Ground tissue can provide flexible or rigid support for the plant. So we'll take a look at some cells on the next slide called collenchyma cells that are ground tissue, and they're somewhat rigid but somewhat flexible, so it's often a support for growing areas of the plant. There are also some really tough ground tissue cells called fibers that provide tough, rigid support for the plant. And then finally, the ground tissue includes those meristematic areas in the stem, lateral meristems, and at the shoot tips and root tips, those apical meristems where cell division is occurring. So in these micrographs, we can see examples of photosynthetic cells, ground tissue cells within the leaf. This looks like a little vascular bundle, but the rest of the cells here that aren't part of this outer covering would be ground tissue. Recall that in the stem, the ground tissue is in the center, and then also a little strip to the outside of these vascular bundles. But this little edge out here, you can kind of see how the cell walls are a little bit thicker. That would be an example of a cell type of ground tissue that provides the flexible support for a growing plant organ. Finally, let's take a look at the plant dermal tissue. As we mentioned, this is the cell layer that covers the outer part of the plant body, so it covers all of the organs. It includes epidermal cells, which are mostly what we see here in this micrograph of a leaf, but it also includes guard cells. These two cells that are a little bit smaller than the epidermal cells are guard cells, and their function is to open as it is now or come together to close the pore, which is this structure right here on the leaf, or the stomata. So the guard cells allow the plant to take in carbon dioxide when it needs it to make carbohydrates through photosynthesis, and it allows it to get rid of oxygen that's produced via photosynthesis. So they're playing a very important role in gas exchange. This epidermis is somewhat watertight. So plants have a cuticle, which you can kind of see on the outside of these epidermal cells. And the function there is to keep water in. So the epidermis is this protective covering, but it's also helping the plants to keep water in. But they can't be completely airtight. They need to exchange gases. So that's what the stomata is doing for the plant. Other functions or other structures of the dermal tissue include trichomes, and those are little hairs that are sometimes on the leaf surface. Sometimes those are important in preventing water loss at the stomata or deterring herbivores from eating a leaf. So the dermal tissue helps to separate the plant from its environment, to prevent water loss, to protect the plant from disease or herbivory, and it also helps with the absorption of water. Roots are covered, the growing area of the root is covered with tiny little hairs called root hairs. Those are part of the dermal tissue, and those hairs are primarily where water absorption is occurring in the plant body. Okay, so we've looked at the dermal tissue, the ground tissue, and the vascular tissue. Now we're going to look at the plant organs. And an organ is part of an organism that is self-contained, has more than one tissue type, and a specific function. So that definition would include the leaf, the stem, and the roots of plants. It also would include reproductive organs such as flowers and fruits, but we'll focus on those later in the semester. So for now, we'll take a look at the vegetative organs, the leaf, the stem, and the roots. And the main function of most plant leaves is to photosynthesize and generate a source of carbohydrates for the plant, to feed the plant. The main function of the stem is to support the leaves, hold them up high so that they're not getting shaded out by other plants so that they can intercept the sun. And it's also conducting fluids like water up from the roots to those leaves, and then conducting photosynthate that's generated in the leaves down to the roots or to other parts of the plant. And finally, the last organ that we'll look at is the roots. And the roots function to anchor the plant, to keep it in one place. They also, as we just mentioned, are involved with absorbing water from the soil. And in many cases, the root is involved with storage. So think about a root like a carrot. So it is a big fat root, and the plant is storing a bunch of sugars inside that root. So it's storing those sugars so that it can use them whenever it needs them. Okay, and then finally, so we're familiar with the plant tissues and the plant organs. An organ system is a group of organs that work together to perform one or more functions. So for example, in the human body, we have a digestive system, which includes your stomach and your small intestine and your large intestine. So many organs that are performing a function. They're helping, in the case of the digestive system, they're helping you get energy from your food and eliminate your waste. In plants, there are only two organ systems, the shoot system and the root system. The shoot system includes the stem, the leaves, and the above ground reproductive organs, such as flowers. The shoot system, which we see here shown in green, is usually above ground. There are some plants that have underground stems. So a potato is an example of an underground stem. Ferns have rhizomes, which are underground stems, but normally you can identify the shoot system pretty easily because it's the parts of the plants that are above the ground. One of the functions is to elevate the plant above the soil so that the leaves can intercept the sun and photosynthesize. The shoot system is also involved with reproduction. So those flowers need to be out in the sun, advertising to attract pollinators. The shoot system is also involved in the dispersal of seeds in the angiosperms via fruits. And as we mentioned, one of the main functions of the stem is conduction. So there's a lot of movement of fluids within the shoot system. The root system, which we see here underground in the pot in this diagram, includes roots. This is an example of a plant that, like a carrot, has a thick taproot and then also lateral roots coming off of the plant. So the shoot system includes tap roots, it includes lateral roots, it's usually below ground, and it has the same functions that we just talked about for roots: anchoring, absorption, storage, and conduction. So in conclusion, you should know the main features of the plant cell, particularly those that we listed, which distinguish plant cells from animal cells. You should know the difference between meristematic and adult tissues. So the meristematic tissues are the areas of the plant that are actively dividing, the root and shoot tips, and then also the lateral meristems within the stem. You should know the location and functions of the 3 types of adult tissues: the dermal tissue, which surrounds the outside of the plant, the ground tissue, and also the vascular tissue, which we know is important in transporting materials around the plant body. You should be familiar with the functions of each of the plant organs that we discussed: the leaf, the stem, and the root, and how those organs function within the 2 plant organ systems, the root system and the shoot system.